the sewing machine fundamentally impact 19th and early 20th century society with clear influence on the roles and cultural expectations of women during this time period. In this video, I'll discuss the way the sewing machine would impact working women, its impact on the cultural expectations for women homemakers, and the effects of the sewing machine on women's liberation movements of the early parts of the 20th century. The invention of the sewing machine and its perpetration into domestic life and industry had a profound impact on the lives of women in the 19th century. Many women's lives in this period of time could be said to be intrinsically tied to the textile and dressmaking industry and in home dressmaking. According to a list of women's employments based on the 1881 census taken from the English Woman's Review published on February 15, 1884, the fourth most common occupation for a woman below being unemployed, a child under 5, or an indoor servant were milliners, dressmakers, or staymakers, with 357,995 employed. Clothes of this time were largely provided by professional dressmakers and unskilled seamstresses, or otherwise handmade by women at home. Because of the activity of sewing was and still is today to a large degree tied to women as a historically women's industry, the invention of the sewing machine had a large impact on this population. The impact of the sewing machine greatly influenced women in employment and drastically changed many women's positions in industry at the time. Before the invention of the sewing machine, a large number of women worked as seamstresses who pieceworked garments for large manufacturers. They could work at home, and they often paid overhead costs and had to make arduous treks to the city to pick up pre-cut fabric and patterns designed by men. According to A Needle, a Bobbin, a Strike, Women Needleworkers in America, sewing women were very poorly paid. A shirt could require up to 20,000 stitches. 6 women in the 1820s could finish no more than 6 to 9 shirts a week, laboring 12 to 14 hours a day for 6 days. For this, they were paid on average 12.5 cents a shirt. With thousands of women who sought employment, the manufacturers kept low wages to deal with the massive labor supply pool. Women workers of this time were among the most exploited wage laborers of this time period. According to Matthew Carey, the estimated annual wage would amount to around $36.40 in 1833, or $1,361.42 in 2024. In the following decades, though, these conditions worsened in the era of the sewing machine. According to Manifold, in the late 1850s, each machine was estimated to perform the work of 6 hand sewers. Alice Ryan calculated that there were 73,290 women displaced by the machines in New York City alone in 1862. However, in tandem with this came the rise of ready-made, mass-manufactured clothing from garment factory production lines that employed the usage of large industrial mechanical sewing machines, much different from the home sewing machines advertised in newspapers. According to the Mill Museum, for the most part, industrial sewing machines were larger and heavier than home models. Often they were designed to be bolted to the floor to cut down on vibrations. Thus, former shirt women shifted from a cottage industry into these garment factories, often called sweatshops. Despite this industry featuring similar wages to before, and often dangerous workplaces, according to the Library of Congress, as the century progressed, a growing number of women and children were a part of an urban and industrialized workforce. By 1900, most Americans employed in manufacturing could no longer work at home with their hands, but in centralized factories with powered machinery. The sewing machine would serve to provide a more efficient way of making clothes for especially married, unemployed middle-class women. Because the growing middle class of this time arising from the Second Industrial Revolution, the popularity of the sewing machine soared, as the consumers of a more financially able, vastly growing middle class could afford to purchase sewing machines in tandem with high-class women. The sewing machine, as a middle and high-class product, would also go on to perpetrate the myth of the cult of domesticity, a prevailing value of 19th century America that idealized that the true position of women, especially those of middle and high class, was in taking charge of their home and overseeing domestic life by fulfilling the wishes of their husbands and raising their children. The invention of the sewing machine in common house use only served as evidence that women belong in their homes. According to the Mill Museum, society generally regarded it as proof that the code of domesticity actually existed and that these sewing rooms were manifestations of women's increasing power within the home. Popular rhetoric of this also concluded, according to Baum and Klepp 2020, that the sewing machine was a labor-saving device that would free women from the drudgery of hand sewing and allow them to devote more time to their families and to themselves. However, this myth ignored the fact that the decision of purchasing the sewing machine came out of the husband's pocket as they controlled the family bank accounts, not the women in their myth of a cult of domesticity. Furthermore, despite the supposed empowerment of women that found in the sewing machine and their roles within the myth of the cult of domesticity, women still found themselves dissatisfied with their lives, leading to a rise of women's liberation movements toward the end of the 1800s and the turn of the century. While the workplace offered poor conditions and back-breaking work for as little as 25 cents a day, the code of domesticity at home was no better, as one faced oppression and sometimes even faced domestic violence. As the U.S. Department Office of Justice states, the American criminal justice system did not perceive domestic violence as a crime, not even a problem. The growing dissatisfaction of women in American society would be expressed by the brave women such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton. The cultural importance for women could prove to be a large factor in the oppression of women in this time, as Caroline Dahl states. The command of society to the uneducated class is marry, stitch, die, or do worse. This expectation of women would prove to be the undeniable connection to sewing to women in society, much else proved to be considered to be unsuitable for women. In the article From Creation to Industrialization, How Sewing Machines Influence Women in America by Avery Efald, it states, the early 1900s saw several court cases arguing that women were physically inferior to men, that work upset the menstrual cycle, and that women could not work the same number of hours as men. These principles, perpetrated by the sewing machine, would encourage the emergence of the women's liberation movements in America and the urge for women to fight against these principles to protect their identities and a right to equality in both the workplace and at home. At the same time, many sweatshop workers would, urged by the growing spread of feminist ideas, go on strike to protest unsafe conditions, hours, and wages. Many independent labor movements occurred at this time, including the Lawrence Textile Strike, sometimes referred to as the Bread and Roses Strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts in 1912, led by the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW, over cuts in pay. Another prominent protest held by women around this time would be held by the Ladies' Waist and Dressmakers Union in 1911 over the deaths on March 25, 1911, as the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire claimed the lives of 146 workers, with some girls as young as 14 as they were locked inside of the factory. These protests would go on to feed into a growing women's rights movement from the late 1800s to the late 1910s, as one woman would push for a new amendment granting the right to vote, to better the freedoms of women in the eyes of the government, but also in workplaces through these protests. Interestingly enough, the sewing machine would also serve an alternate role in this new social movement. Despite the way the machine perpetrated oppression of women at the time, the sewing machine also found a role in the fight for women's rights, as it would be used to make the Blue garment and eventually Chanel's little black dress. These outrageous garments made impactful fashion statements as representation of the struggle for rights for women at this time, representing a rejection of the same gender roles set by the sewing machines and society. However, the overall consequences of the sewing machine is aptly described by Efald. Joanne Perkin continues her argument, making this key statement. Sewing machines were not liberating for women who tried to make a living by sewing. In conclusion, the sewing machine's profound impact on society revolutionized the clothing industry and transformed the nature of women's work in both the home and in factories. For working-class women, it indicated the change from cottage industries to large-scale garment factory and shirtwaist factory work, often perpetrating poor working conditions and low wages. And in the domestic sphere, the sewing machine reinforced the cult of domesticity, which emphasized women's roles as homemakers. While it was marketed as a labor-saving device that would free women from the drudgery of hand sewing, it often solidified their roles within the confines of their home. This, paired with the myth of the cult of domesticity as a true identity for women in society, spurred a growing dissatisfaction that fueled the women's liberation movement. Alongside this, the contradiction of the sewing machine as a tool for exploitation and a method of limiting opportunities held by women by confining them to either horrific workplace situations or uncomfortable home lives would influence women leaders in the women labor movements and women liberation movements, eventually leading to the 1920 19th Amendment. Overall, the sewing machine's legacy is one of both empowerment and exploitation, illustrating the broader dynamics of technology on cultural, gender expectations, and the unintended consequences of a time-saving tool. The end.